So just a little bit earlier this week, there was a debate in the House of Commons about something called the Legacy Bill. Now, Legacy is dealing with the past in terms of Northern Ireland's history, but also the history here in Great Britain as well, the whole of the UK really, in terms of terrorism, in terms of terrorist acts, in terms of what happened. And there is a bill at the moment going through Parliament, the Legacy Bill, which is about prosecuting people or how we should deal with the past. And there are lots of people who are in all parts of the UK and Ireland as well, who've been victims of terrorist violence during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. But of course that spilled over to England. There were many, many victims here as well. I just want to play you a clip of one of the Northern Ireland MPs, a man called Jim Shannon, whose relative was murdered by the IRA 5 decades ago. This was in the House of Commons a couple of days ago. And this is Jim Shannon, a DUP MP, talking about his relative. This is a very, very strange thing and a very moving thing, I think, to see in our seat of Parliament in the House of Commons. Just the emotion that is still there 5 decades later, and many people who are still dealing with what happened a long time ago, but seems to them as if it happened yesterday. Here's what Jim Shannon told the House of Commons.
I'm sorry, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Sometimes when you're at the end, Mr. Deputy Speaker, your emotions get you, and they do, and they get me today. Because 50 years ago, my cousin was murdered. He's the light of our family. A good man with a good heart. I loved his family and his community. My aunt was robbed of the opportunity to see him have the joy of his own children, grandchildren. And I was robbed of my childhood hero and friend. The perpetrators were never brought to justice, all three of them.
A very emotional Jim Shannon there, a Democratic Unionist MP from Northern Ireland, talking about the murder of his cousin, and someone else who is a victim of what the IRA did. And of course there are many other victims, not just IRA victims, but victims of loyalist terrorism. There are victims of what the British state did as well. But specifically talking about the IRA, they were the perpetrators of the 1974 Birmingham pub bombings. And Julie Hambleton is with us. Her sister Maxine was just 18 when she was murdered in that bomb. And this legislation is trying to in some way deal with the legacy of the past. Now, I worked in the Northern Ireland office. I worked for 2 Northern Ireland Secretaries of State when I was a special advisor, and legacy was one of the biggest policy issues. Probably Brexit was the other big one, certainly in regard to Northern Ireland. But this was a very, very difficult thing. When I was there, we weren't talking about amnesties, but now the UK government is. Julie is a campaigner for justice for the 21. Julie, thank you very, very much indeed for joining me this afternoon on talkTV.
Thank you for inviting me on, Peter.
Julie, what do you make of what the government wants to do? Because the House of Lords earlier this week attempted to take out a provision that would allow an amnesty for people, what is effectively an amnesty for people who were the perpetrators of things like the bomb that murdered your sister. And now the House of Commons and the government has put it back in. What do you make of that?
All of our families, we are a group of families who lost our loved ones in the Birmingham bombings in 1974, which you highlighted. And we are also part of another group called the Truth and Justice Movement, where it's a group of cross-community families. So there's Kate Nash from the Bloody Sunday, there's Raymond McCord, who lost his son to the UVF, there's Joe Campbell, whose father was an RUC officer who was shot dead by a state agent. There's Kathy, who lost her sister, who was beaten to death and raped multiple times, where she had to have a closed coffin, as did Raymond's son. And also Michael Gallagher, whose son was killed in the Omagh bombings, and we come together as one. There is no religion, there is no politics, and there is no colour where we're concerned. All we want is what any family would want whose loved one has been murdered, is truth, justice and accountability. This bill is the most obscene piece of legislation that any government could possibly not only consider but want to implement into the statute books of the country that claims to have provided law and order to the Western world. We will become the laughing stock. This bill has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with reconciliation. And by the way, in the legislation, reconciliation, I believe, is mentioned something along the lines of 186 times. 185 of those are in the headings. It's not mentioned anywhere about reconciliation, and who would want to reconcile with the murderers of your loved ones? This is all to do with this government and all of its predecessors, because they want to bury the evidence of where they have colluded, and in some certain circumstances they have been complicit in many of the murders. Now, for those people who may not be aware of this, and they might be thinking, oh, I'm just a conspiracy theorist, just look up the name
absolutely not.
Steak
You're
Knife.
absolutely not.
Just look up the name Steak Knife. Frank Scappaticci, who allegedly died a couple of months ago, was a top MI5 double agent, and he was a top IRA commander that used to torture and murder people if they were believed to be what they called touts, that they believed to be the agents for the British state. And he was one of the biggest double agents going. And this government, they do not give that for any victim. No, there is no thought and no consideration for any of the victims' families or any of the survivors either.
So Julie,
and that's why they're trying to push this bill through.
If the killer or killers, the people who planted that bomb in or any bombs like it, the IRA killers or other terrorist loyalist killers or members of the security forces who killed people or colluded, as you said, if they came forward and said, look, I've done this, after this bill, the Legacy and Reconciliation Bill becomes an act, what would then happen? Just paint a picture for people who are maybe listening, who perhaps are too old or too young, I should say, to remember the Troubles or haven't been affected the way you have. Just paint a picture of what will actually happen. Well,
nothing will happen, and that's the whole point. What will happen is they can come forward to this alleged independence. Now, remember, I know I'm going off on a slight tangent, but there is nothing independent. Anything that the British government, any British government, irrelevant of what their political side is or their colour, is never going to be independent. If one of the terrorists was to come forward and say, I did it, I did this, this and this, and I was one of those who murdered the 21 people in Birmingham, they'd get immunity. They would never, ever see the light of day inside of a courtroom. Now, the other thing that people won't be aware of, more than likely, is that this obscene piece of legislation literally removes all of our rights, the families and the survivors, all of our rights to bring any criminal case or any civil case. They're also removing the rights for any inquests to take place or any inquests that are actually in the process now. If those inquests are not completed within a very specific time frame, and I think it's, let's say it was to come into law in September, I believe, I might be wrong and I'm happy to be corrected, I believe you have to have the inquest completed within 3 months. Yeah. Where on earth and how on earth can that possibly be, one, democratic and two, legal? Because Chris Heaton Harris, because I was watching Jim Shannon on Tuesday, I watched the whole debate. Yeah. And you said in the introduction about how it feels as though it was yesterday. These politicians want us to move on. They believe that they can tell us who have lost our loved ones, that they are in a position to tell us to move on. They are in no position to move on, because I can assure you that if one of their own had been blown up and had been left with only parts of their bodies left, like my mother identified my sister, and the Riley brothers, 2 brothers of Irish descent, they were Catholics, and they were both killed in the same pub as my sister. And the one brother was going to celebrate with his brother the news of his wife being pregnant, because they just got married, and he never got to see his son. Got the 2 lads who were of West Indian descent walking past one of the pubs. The youngest was 16. The other one, Paul Anthony Davis, was 17. And the police treated them and their families so appallingly because they were black that Neil Tommy Marsh's mother, the youngest, Neil Tommy Marsh, was 16. His mother only discovered in 2019, when we had to fight for our inquest. The police and MI5 and MI6 didn't want us to have our inquest resumed. Why would that be? What is it they've got to hide? But his mother, Hilda Marsh, only discovered that he didn't die in the pub because they didn't bother to tell her. They only went to tell her that he was killed in the bombings, and she was a very pious, beautiful lady, and she believed that he had died in the pub, and he hadn't.
Julie, can I ask you one more question and then I'll let you go? Do you think you'll ever have peace over Maxine's death?
None of us will have peace. If this legislation is allowed to go through the books as a piece of law in the UK, they are literally ripping away every possible opportunity for any of the 3,600 families and any of the survivors to ever get any kind of justice, civil or criminal. Our legal team, KRW Law, are based in Belfast and have represented us for 9 years pro bono.
Yeah.
It wouldn't matter how much money we ever had, not that we don't have any. We have to go out on the streets to beg for funds because the legal aid refused us 14 times legal aid in England and Wales. Why would we refuse legal aid?
Julie,
we're British citizens. Our loved ones were British citizens. And all they are doing is spitting on their graves and their memories.
Julie, you've been treated appallingly, and I think that you've illustrated this issue very, very well for a lot of people, and I want to thank you for talking to me today. That's Julie Hambleton, who's a campaigner for justice for the 21 whose sister Maxine was just 18 when she was murdered by the IRA.